The day Delilah Crane discovered she could bend men's minds with nothing but scent, she was standing over a grave with blood on her hands and her grandmother's final warning burning in her pocket. 5 drops only, no more. The price of 6 is your soul. She didn't believe in magic then. Not really. Not until she watched Overseer Crenshaw, a man who'd broken bones for sport, fall to his knees in the barn and weep like a child, begging her forgiveness for sins she hadn't even named. 5 drops of amber liquid on her pulse points, and the devil himself had turned docile as a lamb. That was 3 days ago. Since then, 2 men had granted mercies they'd never shown before. 1 woman slept safely in her bed for the first time in months, and Delilah had begun to feel a coldness in her bones that no fire could warm. The bottle in her pocket was still 3/4 full. The question wasn't whether she'd use it again. The question was, how many pieces of her soul could she afford to trade before there was nothing left to save? The bottle arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in burlap stained with red clay and what might have been blood. Delilah Crane turned it over in her calloused hands, watching the amber liquid catch the thin light that filtered through the slats of the quarters. Her grandmother had been dead 3 days now, buried in the unmarked plot, beyond the tobacco fields where the enslaved of Blackwood Plantation returned to the earth that had consumed their lives. Inside the wrapping, Delilah found a note written in her grandmother's careful hand. Letters learned in secret, practiced in dust and ash, always hidden from the overseer's eyes. 5 drops only, no more. The price of 6 is your soul. Delilah had watched her grandmother, old Ada, wield a strange power over the years. Men who came near her, overseers, the master's sons, even the master himself on occasion, would soften, become pliable as wet clay. They would forget their violence for a moment, their cruelty suspended as if caught in amber, like the liquid in this bottle. Now, at 23, Delilah held that power in her hands. The bottle was small, no bigger than her thumb, with a stopper carved from bone. The liquid inside seemed to move of its own accord, swirling in patterns that hurt to watch too long. The other women in the quarters gave her a wide berth that evening. They knew what old Ada had been. They whispered the word, "Conjure woman," when they thought Delilah couldn't hear, made signs against evil with their fingers, wore their prayers like armor. But Delilah also saw the hope in their eyes, small and fragile as a moth's wing. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could protect them the way old Ada sometimes had. The overseer's name was Silas Crenshaw, and he had hands like iron traps. He'd broken 3 of Mary's fingers the week before for dropping a water pail. The week before that, he'd whipped young Thomas until the boy's back was more blood than skin, all for the crime of looking him in the eye. Delilah found him alone in the barn, counting the tools, making his inventory. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something trying to escape. She wore her best dress, which was really her only dress that didn't have holes, and she'd washed her face in the creek until her skin felt raw. The bottle was tucked in her pocket, warm against her thigh. She remembered her grandmother's instructions, whispered to her years ago when Delilah was still a girl. 5 drops on the pulse points, wrists, throat, behind the ears. The scent finds the weak places in a man's mind, the spaces where his mother's love should have been, where his father's approval never reached. It fills those spaces with want, with need, and need, child, is the strongest chain of all. Delilah had applied the perfume carefully, counting each drop like a prayer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The scent was strange. Not flowers, not spice, but something older. Something that reminded her of thunderstorms and freshly turned earth, and the moment just before dawn, when the world holds its breath. "What do you want?" Crenshaw's voice was sharp, suspicious. He was a thin man with a face like a hatchet blade, all angles and edges. His eyes were the color of dirty ice. "Please, sir," Delilah said, making her voice small, making herself smaller. "I came to ask about Mary. Her hand, it's swelling something terrible. She can't work like that, and I know you need every hand in the fields tomorrow." She stepped closer. The scent rose around her like smoke. She watched it happen. Crenshaw's face, so hard a moment before, began to soften. His eyes lost their focus. His mouth, usually twisted in a perpetual sneer, went slack. He looked at her, and for the first time in the 3 years she'd known him, he looked at her like she was human. "Mary," he said slowly, as if tasting the name. "Yes, Mary, I don't know why He shook his head, confused. "Tell her she can rest tomorrow, in the quarters. Tell her I said so." The words came out at him like water from a cracked dam, helpless and unstoppable. Delilah felt something dark unfurl in her chest. Power. Real power. Not the false power of endurance, of surviving one more day, but actual power to change things, to make them different. "Thank you, sir," she said, and left him standing in the barn, swaying slightly, his expression dreamy and lost. That night, Mary wept with relief. The other women looked at Delilah with new eyes, and Delilah looked at the bottle, still 3/4 full, and wondered what else she could change. Word spread in the careful, coded way. That information traveled through the slave quarters, in glances and careful silences, in songs that meant more than their words, in the way hands touched briefly during work, passing messages like contraband. Delilah had power now. Over the next month, she used it carefully. The head driver, a cruel man named Jeremiah, who took pleasure in others' pain, found himself inexplicably moved to reduce rations less, to allow more rest periods. The master's younger son, who had been eyeing Sarah with predatory interest, suddenly found other diversions. The overseer began to look the other way when the enslaved took extra time to tend their small garden plots. Small mercies, small changes. But in a world where you owned nothing, not even your own body, small mercies were revolutions. Delilah learned the perfume's rhythms. 5 drops lasted exactly 1 day on her skin. The effect on men varied. Some became docile as lambs, others merely distracted, their cruelty dulled but not eliminated. The younger men were more susceptible. The older, harder men took more time, required more proximity. She learned to read the signs. When a man's pupils dilated, when his breathing changed, when his voice softened from command to request. These were the moments when she could bend them, just slightly, toward mercy. But there were limits. The master himself, Edmund Blackwood, was largely absent from the plantation, spending most of his time in Charleston. His wife, a brittle woman named Constance, never came near the quarters. And there were some men, like the slave catchers who occasionally passed through, or the visiting merchants, who seemed immune, their hearts too calcified for even the perfume's magic to penetrate. And then there was the price. Delilah began to feel it in her 3rd week of using the perfume, a heaviness in her limbs, a coldness in her bones that no fire could warm. She would wake in the night, gasping, feeling as though something was slowly draining out of her, drop by drop, like water through a crack. She remembered her grandmother's warning. The price of 6 is your soul. 5 drops. Always 5 drops. Never more. But what did 5 drops cost? What was the price of power, even small power, even power used for good? Thomas was 16, tall for his age, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's quick mind. He came to Delilah one evening as she sat outside the quarters, mending a shirt by the last light of day. "Miss Delilah," he said, his voice careful, "I need to ask you something." She looked up at him, saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Ask." "The perfume," he said bluntly. "The thing you're using. It's real, isn't it? It's not just you being clever or lucky." Delilah set down her mending. Around them, the evening sounds of the quarters rose and fell. Children playing, women cooking, men returning from the fields. Ordinary sounds of ordinary lives lived under extraordinary oppression. "It's real," she said finally. Thomas nodded slowly. "Then why don't you use it to free us, all of us? Why don't you use it on Master Blackwood, make him sign papers, give us our freedom?" It was a question Delilah had asked herself 100 times, 1,000 times. She'd lain awake. At night, the bottle clutched in her hand, imagining it. Walking into the big house, finding the master. 5 drops. Freedom. "Because it doesn't work like that," she said quietly. "The perfume, it makes men softer, more open. But it doesn't make them into different people. It can't make a man do something that goes against his deepest nature, his deepest interests. Master Blackwood's whole world is built on us being property. His wealth, his status, everything he is, depends on the system staying exactly as it is. The perfume might make him kinder for a day, might make him reduce a punishment or grant a small mercy. But make him free us all, make him destroy his own life. No, the magic isn't that strong." "Then what good is it?" Thomas's voice was sharp with frustration. "What good is power if it can't actually change anything that matters?" "It changes things that matter," Delilah said, and there was steel in her voice now. "Mary's hand is healing. Sarah sleeps safely in her bed. You haven't been whipped in a month. Are those things meaningless to you?" Thomas looked away, ashamed. No, they're not. I want more. I want everything." "So do I," Delilah said softly. "But you work with what you have. You use the tools you're given, and you hope that small changes over time might add up to something larger." She didn't tell him about the cost, about the coldness growing in her bones, about the dreams where she stood at a crossroads, and a figure in the distance held out a 6th drop, promising everything, demanding everything in return. His name was Richard Corliss, and he came in spring with a wagon full of fabrics and fine goods for the big house. He was a handsome man in his 40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to see more than most. Delilah was sent to help carry packages to the house, and as she approached, Corliss turned to her. Their eyes met, and something in his gaze made her go cold. He knew. She didn't know how he knew, but he knew. That evening, he found her by the creek where she'd gone to wash clothes. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. "You're wearing something," he said without preamble. "Something old, something dangerous." Delilah's hand went to her pocket, where the bottle always rested now. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. He came closer, but unlike the other men, his eyes remained clear and focused. I'm what they call a sensitive. I can feel magic, sense it like heat from a fire. And what you're wearing, he shook his head, it's powerful, very powerful, and very, very old. Are you going to tell the master? Her voice was steady, but her heart raced. No. He smiled, but it was a sad smile. I'm going to warn you, magic always has a price, girl, always. And the kind of magic you're playing with, its price is terrible. My grandmother used it for 40 years, and I'm sure she paid for every day of it. Corliss sat down on a fallen log, gestured for her to sit as well. Carefully, she did. These old conjurers, they're not like the stories. They don't give something for nothing. They take little pieces at first, your warmth, your dreams, your joy. You barely notice it happening. And then one day you wake up and realize you can't remember the last time you truly laughed, can't remember what it feels like to be wholly yourself. You're just less, a little less every day. Delilah said nothing. She thought about the cold in her bones, the way colors seemed dimmer lately, the way music, which she'd always loved, now sounded distant and thin. But here's the thing, Corliss continued. Even knowing the price, I think you'd pay it anyway. Because what's the alternative? Powerlessness? Watching the people you love suffer when you could help them? No. People like us, we pay the price, and we call it worth it. We just need to know what we are trading away. Did you come here just to tell me this? Delilah asked. No. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. I came to give you this, dried sage and salt, bound with red thread. Burn it in your quarters twice a week. It won't stop the drain, but it'll slow it. Might buy you more time. He pressed it into her hands. Use your power wisely, girl, because it will use you up if you let it. He stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. Don't ever use 6 drops. Whatever happens, whatever you're offered, whatever you're promised, don't. Your grandmother knew. That's why she died when she did, because she was about to break, about to give in. She chose death instead. Remember that. Then he was gone, walking back toward the big house, leaving Delilah alone with the pouch in her hands and new knowledge weighing heavy in her heart. It happened in late summer, when the heat made people mean and the work in the fields was backbreaking and endless. A new overseer arrived. Crenshaw had been dismissed. Too soft, Master Blackwood said after his spring visit. Too permissive. The new man's name was Holt, and he came with a reputation for brutality that preceded him like thunder before a storm. Delilah tried the perfume on him the first week. 5 drops, carefully applied. She positioned herself near him in the yard, letting the scent drift toward him on the humid air. Nothing. His eyes remained hard and clear. His mouth stayed cruel. When young Thomas accidentally dropped a tool, Holt's whip came down without hesitation, without mercy. Delilah tried again the next day, and the next. 5 drops. Always 5 drops. Nothing. Some men, she realized with growing horror, were beyond even the perfume's reach, men whose cruelty went so deep that nothing could touch it, whose hearts were so thoroughly hardened that no magic could penetrate. The quarters lived in fear. Holt was worse than Crenshaw had been at his worst. He seemed to take pleasure in pain, to seek out reasons for punishment. The enslaved learned to move like shadows, to make themselves invisible, to hold their children's hands a little tighter, and Delilah felt helpless. One night, after Holt had beaten old Moses so severely the man couldn't stand, Delilah sat in her cabin with the bottle in her hands. The amber liquid swirled and gleamed in the lamplight. She could hear Moses's labored breathing from the next cabin, could hear his wife's soft crying. 6 drops. The thought came to her like a serpent sliding through her mind. 6 drops would be enough. 6 drops would make even Holt vulnerable. 6 drops would break him, would bend him, would make him stop. All it would cost was her soul. But what was a soul compared to Moses's broken body? What was her soul compared to the suffering of everyone in the quarters? Wasn't that the very definition of sacrifice? Giving up something precious for the greater good. She pulled the stopper from the bottle. No. The voice came from the doorway. Sarah stood there, her face grave in the lamplight. Don't, Sarah said simply. Please, Delilah, don't. You don't understand. I understand that if you do this, we lose you. And losing you would be worse than anything Holt can do to us. Sarah came inside, sat beside Delilah. Your grandmother didn't die to give you a weapon that would destroy you. She died to give you a tool, yes, but also a warning. Some prices are too high, even for this. Then what do we do? Delilah's voice broke. How do we survive him? The same way we've always survived, Sarah said softly. Together. By being strong for each other, by enduring, by hoping, and by believing that men like Holt eventually destroy themselves. Their cruelty eats them from the inside out. We just have to outlast them. Delilah looked at the bottle in her hands. Slowly, carefully, she put the stopper back in place. How do you stay so strong? She whispered. Sarah smiled, sad and knowing. Because I have you. Because I have all of us. Because we're not alone, Delilah. And as long as we have each other, we have something they can never take away. That night, Delilah burned the sage and salt that Corliss had given her. She breathed the smoke and felt the coldness in her bones recede slightly. Not gone, never gone, but bearable. And she made herself a promise. She would use the perfume as her grandmother had intended, for small mercies, for daily kindnesses, for the possible, not the impossible. She would not trade her soul, not even for freedom. Because sometimes survival itself was the revolution. Holt lasted 3 months. It wasn't the perfume that ended him. It was his own cruelty, his own excess. He pushed too hard, punished too severely, created a situation so brutal that even Master Blackwood, returning for a fall visit, couldn't ignore it. The enslaved had learned to document things in their own way. Marks on posts, stones arranged in patterns, information passed in songs. They made sure Blackwood saw the worst of what Holt had done, made sure he understood that productivity was falling, that the enslaved were breaking under the pressure, that Holt's reign of terror was costing money. In the end, it was economics, not morality, that saved them. Blackwood dismissed Holt on a Tuesday afternoon, sent him packing with no reference, no goodwill. The quarters breathed easier that night, and Delilah, watching from her doorway, understood a deeper truth. The perfume was never meant to solve everything. It was meant to buy time, to create small spaces of safety, to help them survive long enough for other things. Economics, happenstance, the world's slow grinding toward change, to work in their favor. She thought of her grandmother, using the perfume for 40 years, 40 years of small victories, 40 years of buying time, 40 years of keeping people alive, keeping hope alive, keeping resistance alive. It seemed like so little, but maybe little things sustained over decades added up to something profound. 5 years passed. Delilah was 28 now. The bottle was half empty, carefully rationed. The coldness in her bones was permanent but manageable. She'd learned to live with it the way you learn to live with any chronic ache. By accepting it, by working around it, by not letting it define her. The war came. Distant at first, just rumors and whispers. But it came closer, month by month, year by year. The enslaved whispered about it in the fields, dared to hope, dared to dream. Delilah still used the perfume, 5 drops. Never more. She used it to protect the children, to shield the elderly, to buy mercy where mercy could be bought. Small things, daily things. But the war was bigger than the perfume, bigger than any individual magic. It was history itself, grinding forward, bringing change, whether people wanted it or not. When the Union soldiers finally came, riding up the long drive to Blackwood Plantation, Delilah was in the fields. She heard the commotion, saw the enslaved running toward the big house, heard the words spreading like wildfire, "Free, free, free." She reached into her pocket, felt the bottle there, still half full, still potent. She'd protected it, rationed it, used it wisely for years. And now it didn't matter. History had caught up. The war had come. Freedom was coming, not through perfume or magic, but through blood and legislation and the terrible momentum of change. Delilah walked slowly back to the quarters. She found Sarah there, weeping with joy, holding her children close. Found Thomas, now a grown man, standing tall and straight for the first time in his life. Found Mary and Moses and all the others, faces uplifted, eyes bright with tears and hope. That night, Delilah sat outside her cabin, no longer slave quarters, just places where people lived, and looked at the bottle in her hands. The amber liquid caught the moonlight, swirled in its mysterious patterns. She thought about pouring it out, about being done with it, about living whatever remained of her life without the cold, without the drain, without the price. But she didn't, because freedom on paper wasn't the same as freedom in practice. Because there would still be men who needed softening, who needed to be reminded of mercy. Because the world was still hard and cruel, and maybe, just maybe, the perfume could still do some good. She would use it more sparingly now. Save it for the moments that truly mattered. Keep it as a tool, a backup, a last resort. But she would keep it. Her grandmother had carried this burden for 40 years. Delilah would carry it for however long she had left. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. Because power, even small power, even power with a terrible price, was too valuable to waste. She stoppered the bottle and put it back in her pocket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles. Freedom was just the beginning, not the end. But tonight, for the first time in her life, Delilah Crane could make choices, could decide her own path, could shape her own future. And that, she thought, was its own kind of magic, the most powerful magic of all. The bottle sat on a shelf in Delilah's small house, nearly empty now. She was 48, her hair shot through with gray, her hands marked with the honest work of a free woman who owned her own land, ran her own boarding house, answered to no one but herself. The cold had never left her bones, but she'd made peace with it. It was the price she'd paid, was still paying, But some nights it was harder than others. Some nights she wondered if it had been worth it. But then she would look around at the community she'd helped protect, the children who'd grown into adults because someone had bought them mercy when they needed it, the families that had stayed together because someone had softened a hard heart at a critical moment, the small incremental changes that had added up over decades to something real, something lasting. A young woman came to her door one evening. She was nervous, clutching a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Miss Delilah," she said, "my grandmother said you might help me. Said you had knowledge." Delilah looked at her for a long moment, saw the desperation in her eyes, the bruise on her cheek, the way she held herself like something broken but not quite beyond repair. "What's your name, child?" "Henrietta. Henrietta James." Delilah nodded slowly. "Come in, Henrietta. Sit down. Let me tell you a story about power and price, about what magic can do and what it can't do, about the long game and small victories." She took the nearly empty bottle from the shelf, held it up to the lamplight. "Enough for maybe a dozen more uses, maybe less." "This isn't a solution," she said. "It's not salvation. It's just a tool, a dangerous tool. But sometimes dangerous tools are what we need to survive." Henrietta leaned forward, eager, desperate, hopeful. And Delilah began to teach her the way her grandmother had taught her, about 5 drops and never 6, about the cold that came with power, about the long game of survival and resistance. The bottle would eventually empty, but the knowledge would persist. The tradition would continue. Women helping women, power passing from hand to hand, generation to generation, small magic, small victories, small mercies that added up over time to something that looked almost like justice. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough.